Okay, Chapter 12, External Conflict in the Greek World. And again, this is a rather lengthy chapter where I run through Greek warfare from the Persian Wars all the way down to the conquest of Alexander the Great. So try to get through it, skim through it is what I recommend. And we'll see if we can just hit the highlights here. And again, if I had to give a theme for Greek warfare, it's sort of particularism of Greece. The Greek city-states, they just wanted to be left alone. And it took some major threat like the invasion of the Persian Empire to force them to cooperate in an extra state fashion. And so there's this constant sort of give and take between pressure, military pressure, forcing the Greeks to do things, or just them. The natural tendency was for them to just not have anything to do with anybody else and just wanting to be left alone. All right, so one of the points here, the Persian War led irreversibly to Athenian naval expansion and then collapse. Athenian aggression against its neighbors precipitated the Peloponnesian War in 431 BC, culminating in the defeat of Athens by Sparta and its allies in 404 BC. I don't think there's anything more to say about the Persian Wars that way. As I said, it kind of forced these states to develop their alliance systems, and you can read through the development of the alliance systems this way. Basically, to fight the Persians required that the Greeks go to war at sea. Sparta was an army and infantry, not a sea-based power, and it didn't have the means, it wasn't a commercial state, to create a navy. It had to rely on its allies for navies, and so Athens, meanwhile, needed a navy to protect its commerce, so it built a very large navy. And during the Persian Wars, everybody deferred to Athens when it came to dealing with things overseas. So Sparta sort of nervously surrendered, abdicated command of the Greek efforts against Persia to Athens after the Persian threat of actual invasion in Greece was defeated in 481 and 480 BC. And so Athens created a naval league called the Delian League. There's Delos out here, the kind of homeland, religious homeland to all the Ionian peoples. Everything here in pink. These are people who spoke the same dialect as Athens, Attic, Ionic, and you can see it goes all the way over here to Asia Minor this way. And so this became the vehicle by which the Greeks rooted out Persian garrisons when the Persians conquered this region, all along the Aegean and then beyond. They went along the south coast of Anatolia. Let's go back to another map. They defeated the Persians at the Battle of Eurymedon River over here. They defeated the Persians at Cyprus. They even invaded Egypt. And the next thing the Persians knew was that suddenly the Delian League has got this influence in the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Persian western flank of the Persian Empire was suddenly exposed. So they had to deal with that. And so Pericles was, again, the genius for this strategy of looking at three directions: the grain trade up here, the grain trade from Egypt, and the grain trade from Sicily. And what he tried to do was sort of harness and monopolize the three sources of grain to force commercial states aligned with Sparta to come over to the Athenian side or face maybe not getting any grain at all. He actually tried to manipulate the flow of grain to the urban Greek world, and this was becoming a very urban place at that time. So the allies of Sparta forced Sparta to go to war with Athens. It was either that or they would have to join the Delian League and leave Sparta a very marginalized and isolated state. And so we had this long war, the Peloponnesian War, from 431 to 404 BC. Long, desultory war, very destructive conflict in which Sparta ultimately prevailed with Persian help. And one would think, okay, 30 years of war, the Greeks are done with that. And no, if anything, warfare continued to accelerate in the next period down to about 336 BC. You know, why is a good question. Typically what we say is that what we saw in the 5th century BC is the emergence of these great empires, the Delian League Empire of Athens, which controlled all of this. The Peloponnesian League Empire of Sparta, in which most city-states were forced to choose either to be on the Athenian side. And in the case of the Athenians, we should point out, these allies had to pay contributions, which became tribute. Originally, it was military contributions. The continual contribution of military forces became odious to the Greeks' neighbor states, and they preferred to just pay cash. The Athenians took the cash and built a bigger fleet, and when they did so, it was an Athenian fleet. And so they demilitarized their allies and became in a very dominant position. There were some 300 city-states in the Dealing League when it was founded in 478 BC. By 454 BC, only 17 of those states were still providing military contributions. And by the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, 431 BC, Athens and only 3 other states were providing actual contingents to the Dealing League forces, to give you an idea of that progression right there. So we say that despite the destructive character and duration of the Peloponnesian War, the threshold of violence in the Greek world seems only to have accelerated in the subsequent era. The inevitable result was to leave the city-states of the Greek mainland divided and resentful at the very moment that external military threats emerged on their horizon. These being the Macedonians, as well as the Persians. Threats were emerging. States that had assimilated Greek culture to some degree. Cultural advantages, the advances of Greek civilization were more or less assimilated by neighboring people such as the Macedonians. Green region up in here. The lowland here is what the king controlled. Pella was its capital right here. Under their kings, Philip II, from 359 to 336 BC, and Alexander the Great, his son, 336 to 323 BC, the Macedonians were able to exploit Greek advances in military technology and battlefield tactics to suppress resistance in Greece itself, and then proceed to overthrow the hierarchy of the Persian Empire. Alexander campaigned all the way to the Indus Valley and expropriated enormous stores of wealth of the Persian hierarchy, the Persian emperors, had amassed. So here we see the extent of the Persian Empire. Alexander, over a course of about a 10-year march, actually defeated the Persian armies at the Battle of the Granicus River, at the Battle of Issus. He conquered Egypt, then on and defeated the Persians at the Battle of Gaugamela. He then marched down and seized Babylon, up into Persia. He conquered Persepolis, burned the palace to the ground. He then went on to Ecbatana, the ancient Median capital. That's where all the bullion was stored. He immediately started striking that into money to kind of quicken the economic pace. And then he marched out into Afghanistan, all the way down into the Punjab, the northern Indus. He also went up into Bactria, all the way to the Pamir Mountains. From the only thing separating him from the Tarim Basin, which is the direction, that's the westernmost point of Chinese civilization. The very fact that he went here tells us that he was aware of trade going on between East Asia and Mesopotamia, and he wanted to position the Macedonians in that regard. He went all the way down to the Indus. By this point, though, in India, this is all pretty arid out here. Not large populations in terms of military populations. When he got to the Indus, he was shocked to find out that there's big populations there, and that he was regarded as an invader and a barbarian. So he did his best to hold on to India, but he basically bunked out. He left rather quickly, and the Indian Empire, just a portion of the empire, rolled up behind him very, very rapidly. And what consequence of that was the Indians responded with what I call wars of reaction. We see the Mauryan dynasty emerge, the Chandragupta, who actually pushed outward and defeated all the states and conquered Afghanistan. And then his grandson, Ashoka, actually pushed all the way to Iran. And as I said before, was exchanging elephants with the Seleucid kings of Syria. So we can say that Alexander, to a large degree, is rare that we can point to a person and event changing the course of history. But we can say that Alexander took all the accumulated wealth stored in as bullion, as reserves in the Persian capitals, and put it into use to quicken the economic pace, to open up the highway between the Indus, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean. At the very least, we can see this flow back and forth this way. And we can also say that for the next 500 years, this connection, whether by land or by sea, remained open, and if anything, the volume of trade accelerated over time. So we can say, at this point, if not sooner, this kind of globalism was taking place. Now, whether we can connect it to China or not remains another question, but it's interesting that by 100 BC, the Chinese have taken over the Tarim Basin here, and their armies are roving out here in northern Afghanistan and pushed all the way to the Indus as well, which suggests that they became aware that trade in Chinese goods was slipping into this flow without their control of it, and they wanted to control it at that point. Following the death of Alexander the Great, his generals endured 60 years of civil war and a struggle for succession. The survivors ultimately achieved a balance of power among 4 successive states. These were the original state of Macedonia, known as Antigonid Macedonia. We have a state here on what ancient Ionia, known as the Attalid kings of Pergamum, Pergamum being right up here, Pella being right there, the capital of Macedonia, and Pergamum being right here. We have Seleucus, who took over Syria, and so he controlled this region, basically Syria and Cilicia, with his capital at Antioch, and so these are the Seleucids. How big was the Seleucid Empire? It really depends on what period we're talking about. As late as 205 BC, the Seleucid king Antiochus III marched the Macedonian army all the way to the Indus and back. So we can say in 200 BC, the Seleucids probably controlled Mesopotamia and Iran again. Typically, we see they control this area right here, maybe Mesopotamia, but primarily this area right in here, although they had territories along the south coast of Anatolia as well. And then Ptolemy, who was one of Alexander's bodyguards and went all the way to India with him and survived. When Alexander died, he became assigned the satrap or governor of Egypt. He built a big naval force and became controlling the grain supply. And the Ptolemies controlled Egypt, the capital of Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great himself. Alexandria became this enormous, important cultural center. It reached a population that is estimated at 1 million. It was a highly international trading center and production center for artisan production. Glass was produced there. One of the things that starts to take place is the Ptolemies figured out the direction of the monsoon wind, so they would basically send their ships down the Red Sea out to the Horn of Africa to catch the winds at Socotra that would take them to India. And from this, we hear that the Egyptians began to bring back Chinese silk. They produced Chinese silk clothing. They would dye it, they would produce it, and it was the major luxury good of the hierarchies throughout the Roman Mediterranean world. Everybody's wife had to have a silk garment, these diaphanous silk garments this way. And so the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, because they controlled the overland routes to the east, both became sort of fabulously wealthy. This is what we hear about both of these empires. I should also point out that all 4 of these kingdoms were basically absorbed by the Romans, sort of in a clockwise fashion, with the Romans defeating the Macedonians several times, but absorbing Macedonia in 148, 146 BC. By 133 BC, the Attalids of Pergamum ceded their territory to the Romans as well. The Seleucids ultimately were absorbed by Pompey the Great around 62 BC, and then Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies, at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, and this became the private property of the Roman emperors. All of Egypt became the private property of the Roman emperors, who used the grain production there to feed the city of Rome, which by 27 BC was probably in the order of 1 million people as well. So we can see how the history of these Hellenistic, and we call this era the Hellenistic period, which is the period following Alexander, so his death in 323 to 27 BC, because what happened was Aegean culture now was exported. Greeks settled in these capitals overseas. They needed people trained the way the Greeks were trained, the gymnastic educational experience, how to be a hoplite, how to read Greek, how to speak Greek, how to write Greek. Democratic procedures, all these things. This was kind of the standard for educated people now. And natives either adapted to this or they remained sort of submerged below the Greek hierarchy that controlled the entire Eastern Mediterranean world. The Hellenistic era, as I mentioned, was characterized by an expanding reliance on Greek cultural attributes and social institutions across the Eastern Mediterranean basin. The implementation, that's pretty bad, of Greek recursive and political institutions throughout the region facilitated the development of a homogeneous Hellenistic world system. The international elites who ran the world system were educated in the same cultural values. with the attributes of mainstream Hellenic culture supplanted place of origin as a determinant of one's potential to society. And perhaps the most significant result of the campaigns of Alexander the Great was the commercial linkage of two distant world systems, the Mediterranean and the Indian subcontinent. And by means of the latter, this included the eventual linkage with China as well. From this point onward, the two regions remained in open contact, maintaining a steady flow of travelers, material goods, and ideas. Across Eurasia, three great regions of the ancient civilization were now becoming rapidly linked in a common trajectory of economic growth and prosperity.